Major funding for production of the City Club Forum is provided by Nordson Corporation. Additional support provided by the Nord Family Foundation.
Welcome to the City Club Forum. I'm Steve Smith, past president of the club, filling in for President Sheldon Braverman, who is attending an important professional meeting on the beaches of Tahiti. On the week many Americans did taxes, we look at what may be the most important scientific project those taxes support, and a project that is ahead of schedule and under budget. Dr. Francis Collins is director of the National Center for Human Genome Research, a 15-year, $3 billion effort to map the estimated 100,000 genes that make up human chromosomes. This exploration of inner space is looking at the very essence of the biology of human existence. Dr. Collins grew up on a farm in Virginia and was homeschooled until the 6th grade. He received a PhD in physical chemistry at Yale, completed medical school at the University of North Carolina, did postgraduate work in human genetics, and then joined the University of Michigan faculty. He and his colleagues conducted pivotal genetic research identifying the genes for cystic fibrosis and Huntington disease. He was appointed director of the Genome Project in 1993 and continues research in breast and prostate cancers and adult onset diabetes. He is an irrepressible cheerleader for the project, describing discoveries as wonderful, astonishing, fantastic, exciting, extraordinary, and stupendous. Do not expect understatement in today's forum. The Genome Project may allow us to identify, diagnose, and eventually manipulate genetic material to avoid or cure many of our most dreaded diseases. But it also poses enormous threats to privacy. There is the concern that insurance companies, employers, and others might discriminate against those with genetic predisposition to disease. Indeed, one federal report said that already dozens of people have lost jobs and health insurance after genetic testing. And for a time, one HMO threatened to withdraw coverage if a woman carried to term a fetus determined to have the genetic cystic fibrosis defect. And there are some truths that will not set us free. What Dr. Collins calls toxic truth, when someone is told about a genetic problem for which there is no treatment. 5% of the genome budget is to study these ethical and legal issues. Since this is an area in which we hope decision makers will, as someone said, play God the way God plays God, it is perhaps reassuring that the director of the project has a spiritual side. He sees his work as a kind of worship. God isn't afraid of science, he says, and it would be unethical to delay. The British biologist Richard Dawkins described the central driving importance of genes this way: their preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence. We are their survival machines. I am pleased to present the chief detective of genes, as well as a physician, scientist, cheerleader, and some say potential future Nobel laureate, Dr. Francis Collins.
Rah, rah. Thank you very much. That was a delightful introduction, and I'm really honored to have a chance to speak before this forum, both to those in the room and to those who are listening over radio and television. I'm delighted that science and medicine are, in this particular forum, being given a place alongside politics and social commentary and business. And I think this particular topic, the human genome, fits particularly well into this forum, because here is an example of science that is going to have profound consequences for the future of the human race in terms of medical advances, some of which we can predict, some of which we still quite can't, and perhaps also in the way that we view ourselves, because we are engaged in this project basically in reading our own blueprint. You can think of that as a rather historic occasion in the history of a species when you go in and look at your own instructions. And that's what this project is about. As was mentioned in the introduction, this project has been called, actually recently by the Vice President, potentially the most significant organized scientific project ever undertaken. More than splitting the atom, he meant. More than going to the moon, I think he meant. So is that justified? Well, it is an adventure into ourselves to read our own DNA sequence, the whole thing. And we intend to have this done in a rather short period of time, by the year 2005. That's not very far off. This will change medicine in ways that I will begin to touch on in this talk, but which, to be honest, I'm not sure I can completely predict for you once I go beyond 5 or 10 years from now. And yet, here is this project with all of this significance, and I don't think I'm overstating it, although if anybody would, I would. I think this is actually a fair description of what this project is. Yet when I take my own informal poll by asking the person next to me on airplanes, where I spend a fair amount of time, have you ever heard of the Human Genome Project? I get a less than 50% positive response. So this hasn't sort of gotten out there. It doesn't have the kind of public visibility that perhaps going to the moon did. And in a way, I'm concerned about that, because there are many consequences of this project that are going to require public involvement as we seek to identify the best way forward so that this genetic information, powerful as it is used to benefit people rather than to injure them. And I will talk a little bit about the pros and the cons of this, and I would like to be completely honest with you in that regard, that this is a project, while enormously powerful and having much promise to alleviate human suffering, which is the real reason to do it, it also has some thorny issues, and we are not yet in a situation where we can assure the public that this information might not be used to injure them in some way. We have the option of solving some of those problems, and I think we should do so, and I'll comment a bit about that. Rather than sort of launching into a description of what the project is scientifically, I thought I would start out with instead telling you about a family that I know quite well, a family that lives not far from here in the state of Michigan, and one that I've interacted with over the course of the last 5 years as they have sought to figure out why it is that in their particular family so many women have been stricken with breast cancer and ovarian cancer. And the story of this family, in many ways, is sort of the story of what's happening in molecular medicine. Susan is now 37. When she was 20 years old, her aunt was diagnosed with breast cancer, treated effectively for that, and then 2 years later developed ovarian cancer and died of that. 2 or 3 years after that, Susan's mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, treated successfully, and her mother is still alive and doing well. The family began to be concerned, these two women both diagnosed in a close succession. Next, Susan's sister, 4 years older than her, developed breast cancer at age 38. This was a particularly aggressive form of cancer, and despite chemotherapy and surgery, this sister died within 2 years of diagnosis. This left Susan and her older sister Janet wondering, what about them? Then the day came where Janet found a lump in her breast. It was in fact cancer. She was treated with chemotherapy, seemed to have done well from that, was in the process a year later of recovering when she found a lump in the opposite breast. Biopsied an independent cancer, so she's had this twice. Janet is now being treated for that second cancer. Susan, after being anxious about this circumstance for the past 15 or 20 years, became more and more anxious, as you could imagine, with her mother, her aunt, and both of her sisters affected with breast cancer, many of them at an early age. She was convinced that she would be next. And she sought advice about that from numerous medical institutions back around 1990, and all that anybody could say was, well, yeah, it sounds like there is probably something hereditary going on in your family, and you probably are at increased risk, and you ought to consider your options, which are to undergo a mammogram on a very regular basis, starting at a much younger age than usual, And maybe you ought to think about more drastic procedures, such as prophylactic mastectomy, with the hopes that that would reduce your risk if it is as high as you fear it is, even more drastically than the preventive measures of mammography. And of course, there's the ovarian cancer risk, and you ought to worry about that too, but nobody was quite sure what to recommend because we don't have good screening procedures for ovarian cancer that are really demonstrated in this high-risk group to absolutely protect you against what is feared. So Susan became increasingly worried about this, wondering what she should do. She has a daughter who's 12 years old. She feared for her daughter as much as for herself. And after going through these anxieties for a couple of years, she decided to go ahead with the prophylactic mastectomy. Meanwhile, she and her family had been involved in a research study at the University of Michigan, which was aimed at trying to figure out exactly what gene is responsible for this high risk in their family. And at about that time, it became clear that a gene on chromosome 17 called BRCA1, for breast cancer gene number 1, if it is misspelled in a particular individual, carries a very high risk of breast and or ovarian cancer. And in this family, our research group was able to determine that clearly that was the cause of their high risk. And furthermore, we began to figure out who had the misspelled gene and who didn't. And having realized that, we realized that we needed to call the family in and give them the information so that they could plan accordingly, assuming that they wanted to know. And we weren't sure whether they would want to know. And literally, within a few days of our sending out letters to the family to let them know that it was an appropriate time for them to come into the clinic and get this information, Susan walked in to the clinic on her own power, said, "I'm here for my pre-op workup for my double mastectomy, and I just thought I would drop by and see if you have any new information based on this research project." And we did. We had been studying her DNA and looked at the results right there as she was waiting, and realized that she did not have the misspelled gene. She had inherited the normal version from her mother. That meant her risk of breast cancer is the same as the general population, which is far too high, admittedly, but not the drastic, virtually 100% risk that she had in her mind. And so within days of a very drastic procedure, she found out this information, canceled the surgery, was greatly relieved about her daughter, and I think it could be argued that this was a good thing. Now, what's going on here? Clearly, in this situation, there was a hereditary condition, and clearly getting the information about it was of some benefit to this individual. But it's also complicated. Now, I'll come back to Susan, and I'll tell you about a couple of her cousins in a little while, because they had a somewhat different experience with this test, where they didn't necessarily get the good news that they hoped for. Well, listen, virtually all diseases, breast cancer, diabetes, schizophrenia, prostate cancer, hypertension, coronary artery disease, alcoholism, I could go on and on. Virtually all diseases have a hereditary component. What runs in your family? Something probably does. And if it runs in a family, if it is hereditary, that indicates that it's probably encoded within DNA. DNA is the information-containing molecule of all living organisms, and it certainly is of the human. DNA is this wonderfully elegant, simple molecule. It is this double helix, as Watson and Crick figured out some 43 years ago. And the rungs on the ladder of the double helix are where you have the information contained. They can be one of 4 possible letters. The letters are abbreviations for chemical structures. And so it can be either A, C, G, or T. Those are the only 4 possibilities you have. So DNA is written in a language that has a 4-letter alphabet. And all of the information containing capacity of living organisms derives from that DNA information encoded within that 4-letter alphabet. And I would ask you, just sort of sitting there, to think, how many of those letters would it take to specify the biological properties of a human being? How much information would you expect you would need to go from being a single-celled, just fertilized embryo to a fully formed human being, able to think, fight off infections, do all of the things that human beings can do? I guess I would have said it would just be an astronomical number. It would be a number you couldn't even contemplate. Well, it is a big number, but it's a number that you can almost get your mind around. It's 3 billion. 3 billion letters is enough to specify all those instructions. Now, the instructions actually are called genes, and a gene is a packet of DNA, and it may be as short as a few thousand letters, or it may even in some instances be a couple million letters, depending on how complicated that particular instruction is. And we think there are about 100,000 genes, each one of which has a particular instruction encoded within it. So 3 billion base pairs, 100,000 genes, that's what it takes. And having a glitch somewhere in those 3 billion letters, even one letter gone awry, that's a C when it should have been a T, is sufficient in some instances, if it's in a vulnerable place, to place you at risk of some future disease. An analogy, perhaps. Think of each gene as a book, because if you printed out the sequence of, say, the BRCA1 gene, the one responsible for Susan and her family's great distress, that gene, if printed out in an average sort of font size, would occupy a fairly thick telephone book of information. And imagine flipping through the pages of that one letter out of place might be sufficient to cause the havoc in the family. In her situation, in her family, we know now that there are 4 letters missing in one page. That's all it took. And that's just one gene. If you now think of all 100,000 genes, well, you've got 100,000 phone books piled on top of each other. They'd be about as high as the Washington Monument. That's a lot of information. Even though you can imagine it, it's a lot of information. 3 billion is a big number. Even in Washington, D.C., 3 billion is a big number. The Human Genome Project aims to have that information all determined in a publicly available database in the next 9 years. And at the rate we're going, in fact, we may get there a little sooner than that. This is an international project. The U.S. is taking the lead, but several other countries are playing significant roles, particularly England, Japan, Germany, France, and Canada. It has a series of very specific milestones that were set out by the planners of this effort back in 1990 in order to be sure that progress was being made at a measurable level, and I think those milestones have been a very good idea. They involve not only building maps and getting sequence, but stimulating the technology to do this efficiently. And the cost of all of this has come down substantially as a consequence. It is a wonderfully interdisciplinary project in that it involves chemists and physicists and biologists and physicians, computer scientists, engineers, ethicists, lawyers, social scientists, theologians, all of these people playing some role in trying to figure out this blueprint and then figure out how to use it appropriately. And it is in many ways sort of a public-private effort. While the federal government pays for the infrastructure building basic science part of this, getting the maps and the sequence, the private sector is enormously interested in using this information and is investing themselves in making sure that it is used in a way that benefits the public by the development of new therapies and diagnostics as soon as possible. As was mentioned kindly in the introduction, this project is going rather well. We are now about 18 months ahead of schedule. Based on what was predicted back in 1990, we've exceeded those goals now by about 1.5 years. And the budget for this project stands at about 70% of what was predicted to be necessary. So here is a federally funded project, believe it or not, that really is ahead of schedule and under budget and is likely to stay that way. It is a relatively inexpensive project. On the scale of things, the amount of money devoted to this by the National Institutes of Health is 1.4% of their total budget for biomedical research. So this is not an enormous diversion of resources away from other very valuable areas of research. In fact, to sort of put this in perspective, we will spend in this country more money on health care during the course of this City Club Forum here today than we will spend on the genome budget in an entire year. And arguing, as some of us will, that the way we're going to reduce those health care costs is heavily dependent upon figuring this information out, it seems like a wise investment. Okay, I am cheerleading, I confess it. Now, but why are we doing this? It's certainly not to make jobs for people like me. We really are doing this, and here I'll put on my physician hat, because of our mandate, I think, as a society to try to do something about human suffering. That really is the point. The Genome Project has all kinds of arguments going for it, but the major reason I believe that the taxpayers are interested in paying for it and the Congress has endorsed it and fields of medicine are all for it is because it promises to do something about a host of diseases for which our hands have been tied. Now, it won't do that overnight. but it is hard to escape the fact that it's going to have major consequences, and I'll come back to some of those. And there are other positives about this. You can make the argument, and I certainly have done so and will continue to do so, that this is probably a wonderful project for American economic competitiveness. There is all sorts of biotechnology spinning off of this, both in diagnostics and in therapeutics. Every pharmaceutical company of any size now has a genome division because they're convinced that the discovery of these 100,000 genes, which we will have in the next 9 years, will be the ground upon which the new generation of drugs arises. Up until now, most drugs that we use for disease are arrived at largely empirically by just trying a lot of things to see if something works. Now we have the chance to understand the underpinnings of disease at a level of detail that we could not previously have dreamed of, and that should allow us the possibility of truly rational drug design, which may then produce those magic bullets for things like cancer and heart disease that we have not really succeeded so far in finding. And in the other argument one can make for this is that it will reduce healthcare costs, although it won't do that overnight. Well, let's come back to Susan and her family. They do have this 4-letter misspelling in their BRCA1 gene, a CTGA, that has been deleted, that should be there. Susan escaped that because she inherited the normal copy from her mother, but her mother and her 2 sisters who have had breast cancer and her aunt all have this misspelling. Now, does this account for the majority of breast cancer? No. About 5%, actually, of all women with breast cancer have inherited a misspelling of BRCA1. But on the other hand, if you see families like Susan's, where there are many affected women, especially if they have breast and ovarian cancer in some of these individuals, then the likelihood that BRCA1 is involved is much higher. I think one can make the argument in this situation that having the test available was useful to her. And I would like to point out that genetic testing doesn't always mean bad news, which is what people tend to assume. A recent issue of Glamour magazine, I don't read Glamour, but my daughter does, pointed out on their list of 7 things that you didn't have to worry about before and now you do. One of them was genetic testing for cancer, how to handle the bad news. Assuming, therefore, that that's the only kind of news you would get out of this kind of a test. Happily, that's not the case, but it can sometimes be the case. Susan got good news. What about her cousins? Well, let me come to them. Emma and Jackie are first cousins to Susan and Janet. They are related through their father. Emma and Jackie's father is the brother of the 2 women I started out telling you about. He's fine. Now, what does that tell you about the likelihood that he might also carry a misspelled BRCA1 gene? Well, not much, because men can have this alteration and have relatively little in the way of consequences. They may have a slight increased risk of prostate cancer, although that's still controversial. But it's the women who really pay the price for this particular alteration. But that wasn't known until very recently. So Emma and Jackie, their closest affected relative, are their aunts and their cousins, and they assumed, as most people would, therefore, that they're at some distance from this disease, and therefore they're probably not at as high a risk. Now, that turns out not to be correct, because it turns out their father did have this alteration. Emma and Jackie came in seeking to know the results for themselves, expecting to hear that this was all fine and they need not worry, and in fact it turns out that both of them did inherit the misspelled copy of the gene, placing them at about an 85% risk of getting breast cancer sometime during their life and perhaps a 50% risk of ovarian cancer. What to do? Emma, the oldest, at that point was 40 years old. Her cousins already had cancer at that point. She had not really done anything as far as surveillance. She was denying that there was really much significance for her, understandably. Asked, therefore, to be worked up immediately. We did a mammogram that same day that she found out her genetic test result, and it showed a small lesion in her right breast, which was biopsied and turned out to be cancer. So she went from thinking she was at low risk to finding out she's at high risk to finding out she has cancer in the space of 24 hours. Very tough situation for somebody to go through. She subsequently decided that for her, the best surgical option was bilateral mastectomy because of her fear that she would develop an independent tumor, as her cousin had a few years earlier. And after going through that, and the good news was her nodes were negative on the side of the cancer, so her likelihood of being cured of that is very high, probably 95%. She then worried about her ovarian cancer risk, and after waiting another year, deciding she wasn't planning to have any more kids, she then had her ovaries removed as well. These are drastic choices that we present women with, and I think they are sobering, and they cause you to be a little less enthusiastic about rushing out to test everybody when you realize that the positives are placed in a very tough spot. What about Jackie? Jackie also has the alteration. She had mammograms done that were negative, but she found it very difficult to live with this sense of impending doom and this very high risk. So she sought to obtain prophylactic bilateral mastectomy. She applied for that. Her surgeon felt that she was qualified, but her insurance company refused to pay for it. Now, they did not know of her alteration in this gene because she was very careful not to tell them, being fearful, in fact, of the consequences for her if they knew just how high a risk she was at, that she might lose her coverage. In fact, I will tell you, all of these people who I've been describing are real people, but these are not their real names. They have given me permission to talk about their family as long as I'm careful not to tell you who they are by name, because they are all fearful that they will lose their insurance, or their children will, if this information were known, a topic that I think is very timely right now. Jackie went through a long battle with her insurance company, getting many letters from physicians documenting the appropriateness of doing this without giving away the whole story. And as a consequence of those letters, eventually was able to get the surgery done. The surgical specimens were carefully looked at, and it turns out she already had not one but 2 cancers, which would have appeared in a matter of a few months. And obviously, the earlier those are detected, the better. So these are tough problems. Both of these women, Emma and Jackie, would tell you that this DNA test saved their life. I don't know whether I'm completely convinced of that, but you could make that argument. In both of their circumstances, it allowed them to find out they were at risk in time to treat a cancer before it had spread. So I think this opens up the question then of the medical consequences of this project. And I'm using breast cancer as an example. It's a particularly good paradigm, but there are others that I could have told you about. Colon cancer, for instance, has a very similar story. And I would ask you, should we have a crash program to go out and detect the people at high risk? Probably 1 in 500 women are in this situation of being at a very high risk, and we have almost the technical ability to go out and find them. In one particular population, that of the Ashkenazi Jewish population, 1 in 100 women are in this situation. They have a very specific deletion of 2 letters in one part of this gene, which is very simple to test for from laboratory terms. So technically, we could do it, but should we do it? Well, the barriers to that are the following. One is a technical one. If you imagine that book that I talked about, that phone book of BRCA1, to actually look in hundreds of thousands of people for, in each one of them, a misspelling on some page of that is very challenging, and no laboratory is yet really capable of doing that more than sort of 1 sample every 2 months. The idea of doing this for hundreds of thousands of people has not yet become a reality, but it's getting there, and there are many companies setting up to do this, anticipating a great demand. A major barrier, the medical management questions. What do we tell women in this situation? Do we know that these screening procedures like mammograms are actually going to help them? We don't have enough data. We know that mammograms work for the general situation of women over 50, but what about women in this special category? Can we say for sure that they are going to be well served by choosing that option? We need that data desperately, and we don't have it. What about all the counseling that goes into this? Having worked with this family and others like it, I can tell you this is the most incredibly intense experience for people to go through. Getting this kind of information about themselves and their families and all of the consequences of that, that's not the sort of thing where you sort of drop it in somebody's lap and say, oh, well, you have a mutation, have a nice day. People really need the chance to think through that and ask questions and come back and ask some more. And who's going to do that if we begin offering this on a large scale? Most physicians have not had 1 single bit of genetics in their training. And we have an urgent need to get that information into their hands so that they can begin to apply this brand of molecular medicine, which at the present time is very unfamiliar to them. And then the other barrier, which is a very major one, is the discrimination one. I mentioned that with regards to health insurance, but that's not the only area of potential discrimination. Employment is another, and I'll say something in a minute about potential solutions to that. I'm happy to tell you that given all of these conflicting pressures on testing versus not testing, that the National Cancer Institute is about to set up something that I'm very excited about, and that is going to be a National Cancer Genetics Network. This is a way of dealing with the fact that there are many women out there who are interested in having this information, and yet it's not easy for them to get it. The number of research protocols currently available to them are rather few. This network will basically be a national research protocol. Any physician who wants to enroll their patients in this can apply to this network, receive educational information that will allow them to do a good job of counseling the patient. Then the patient will get education about the pros and cons of testing, be able to make up her own mind about whether she wants this or not. And then, based on those results, we will be able to find out what happened, because this will also include a registry, a confidential one, to keep track of outcomes. And we really need that information. So that, I think, is a very important step forward. All of this is part and parcel of the Genome Project, but it's really now talking about the consequences. The ethical, legal, and social implications of this effort were recognized from the start as being among the most important parts of this, and we could not divorce the science from its consequences, or we would really regret it. So the ELSI program, Ethical, Legal, and Social Issues, was born 5 years ago and has been focusing on these issues, I think with some considerable progress, but we still have a way to go, particularly because we're now sort of at the point where scholarship has done a great job of identifying the issues and potential solutions, but now legislative solutions need to kick in, which means politics gets involved. You may have noted that the Senate of the United States debated last night the Kassebaum-Kennedy bill on health insurance reform. In that bill, thanks to a great deal of hard work on the part of people working with the Genome Project, there is specific language that says genetic information should not be used by health insurers to deny coverage. That's the first time at the federal level that has been present, and I am absolutely thrilled with that. Although I will also tell you it's not a perfect bill. There are ways in which people can still have genetic information used against them in health insurance that I think would trouble most of us. You didn't get to pick your genes. I didn't get to pick mine. Should they be used against you to deny you health care? I think that's an inherently troubling situation. And yet we have a system in health insurance that not only permits that, but sort of encourages it. We all have these things. We all have glitches in our DNA, probably 4 or 5 pretty bad ones, and 20 or 30 not so great ones. And it's only a matter of time, as things are going, before it will become possible to figure out what your own particular glitch is. So we all have pre-existing conditions. Don't fool yourself. They're written into our DNA. And if that's reason enough to take away your health insurance, who's going to be left covered? We have a system that's unjust, and it's also going to be unworkable. So we have to fix it. And I think the Kassebaum bill is a wonderful step in the right direction, but we have to go further than that. Employment has been dealt with to some degree by a recent ruling by the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, but there are still loopholes in that. Privacy, medical records leak like a sieve. We have to do something so that this information doesn't fall into the hands of people that you wouldn't feel comfortable knowing about it. There are issues about informed consent, and there's this whole business of education, not just of physicians, but of the public. A lot of the public thinks that DNA is a perfume. You can go to the health food store and buy DNA and RNA in a bottle and eat the stuff. I don't know what people think that's doing for them, but it betrays a certain level of misunderstanding about the whole process. So in the future, just to conclude, in the future, where will this all lead us? I would say in another 5 to 10 years, you will have the chance, if you want to submit yourself to testing to find out what your own predispositions are as far as future illness. What diseases are you most at risk for? Will you want to know? Well, if we can deal with the discrimination parts, I suspect your decision about whether you want to know will largely be predicated upon the question, what can I do about it? Because if it's just dropping bad news in your lap and there are really no options for you as far as reducing that risk, maybe it's not so helpful, and maybe you'll say no thanks. There's a quote from Sophocles, which I'm very fond of, which says, "It is but sorrow to be wise when wisdom profits not." Why learn all of this stuff if you can't do something about it? But for many conditions, breast cancer, colon cancer, there will be things that one can do, if you know you're at high risk, to go through surveillance programs in order to reduce that risk of dying of metastatic disease. And I think people will probably be very interested in those things. In the longer term, though, this is not just the point. We don't want to just be like the bookie. We want to be like the fixer that gets to change the outcome in a more profound way. And that is where these gene discoveries are leading in the long run, to new therapies, be they gene therapies or drug therapies, that are based on an intimate understanding of the molecules involved in disease. Those take time, and you can't predict how much time, but they will come. And we will have a brand of medicine 20 years from now that you will scarcely recognize, I suspect. All of this, I think, fits with the natural traditions of medicine to try to push back these frontiers. I'd just like to conclude, therefore, with a quote from Sir William Osler, who most people regard as the founder of what we call modern medicine. And his way of describing medicine, which I think describes what we're talking about here today, is the following: to wrest from nature the secrets which have perplexed philosophers in all ages, to track to their sources the causes of disease, to correlate the vast stores of knowledge, that they may be quickly available for the prevention and cure of disease. These are our ambitions. Thank you very much.
Our guest today at the City Club is Dr. Francis Collins, Director of the Human Genome Project of the National Institutes of Health, discussing the effort to map the human genetic code. We will return to Dr. Collins in just a couple of minutes to answer questions concerning which kind of DNA we should get at the health food store, but first a few announcements. Information on upcoming national broadcasts of the City Club Forum, as well as information on the City Club itself, is now available on the World Wide Web. The address is www.wclv.com. At our forum next Friday, April 26th, our speaker will be Sarah Brady, president of the Center to Prevent Handgun Violence. Sarah's husband, Jim Brady, was crippled in the assassination attempt on President Reagan, and their efforts to enact handgun control laws helped pass what has become known as their Brady Bill. To make reservations for that forum, you can call us at 621-0082. Now for our traditional City Club questions and we hope answers. We would like Dr. Collins to return to the podium. We welcome questions for everyone, those with ordinary genes and those with designer genes, and also from questions from our guests are welcome. To ask a question, raise your hand and one of our City Club genies, Bob Conrad or Marcia Bynum, will arrive with a microphone. So the first question, please.
Dr. Collins, you mentioned in your talk that about 5% of breast cancer patients can trace their disease to heredity in the genes. That leaves about 95% that come from other sources. Most of us, most women, cannot do very much about their ancestors. They can do some of the prophylactic things you talked about, mastectomies and other severe aspects. But the other 95% of the causes of breast cancer, many people feel are attributable to the environment or other causes. To what extent do you think there should be a national commission, very similar to your commission, which studies heredity in the genes, to look at the causes, whatever they may be, of the other 95% of the breast cancer cases, and most likely the environment?
That's a very good question. While the proportion of breast cancer that can be attributed to a very strongly inherited contribution is about 5%, it's likely that another 20 to 25% of breast cancer has hereditary underpinnings. They're just not as strong. We're beginning to get a little bit of an idea of what some of those more weakly acting genes might be. But that still leaves the majority of breast cancer without an obvious hereditary cause. Now, cancer, however, we understand, virtually always comes about because of mutations in DNA. It's just that those are then acquired during life and then give rise to a cancer as opposed to being inherited. It is clear that there are environmental influences like radiation that damage DNA and therefore increase the risk of cancers of all sorts. But what is much less clear is what contribution do the environmental exposures that people who are not working in particularly high-risk industrial environments are receiving, and how much does that play a role in what is clearly a very alarming rate of breast cancer at the present time, with 1 in 8 women developing this disease sometime during their life? Or is that frequency of breast cancer a consequence of changes in our culture? And there is certainly some evidence for that. When you look at the things that seem to represent risk factors for breast cancer, many of them are things that have come about in the Western world relatively recently, such as delaying childbearing, for instance. I think there is a lot of attention to environmental issues. The Human Genome Project within the National Institutes of Health is one of 22 institutes and centers. One of the other 22 is the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, and their entire focus is on the issues being raised in this question. And I would tell you that that is one of the other institutes that we work with the most closely. We sort of think of ourselves as the yin and yang here of disease, that the genetics combined with the environment often explains the outcome. And we may learn a lot from genetics about who is particularly sensitive to a certain environmental insult. Maybe one of the reasons we haven't been able to show that certain environmental exposures are risky is because for 95 or 99% of the population they're not, but for that 1 or 2% that has a particular genetic endowment, they may be. So these two things working together, I'm hoping, will shed light on what has admittedly been a murky and sort of frustrating area.
Dr. Collins, welcome to the City Club.
Thank you.
I think I should explain one thing about our former president, Steve Smith. He's from Iowa, and the only doctor he's met was a veterinarian.
Well, I was going to say, he certainly seems to have the gene for punning. In fact,
It's the worst kind of humor. Yeah. This has really bothered me. I've had this on my wish list for 5 years at the forum. I'm so pleased you're here.
Thank you.
But what bothers me is that throughout history, whenever we had a dramatic change, like the Industrial Revolution, about 1760, we had about 150 years to adjust. Technology has taken that away, that comfort zone. And I look upon this in the sense that it's collapsing so quickly. By the time we assume we know something, it's collapsed again. And I'll leave you with the warning of Marshall McLuhan. We see the president through a rear view mirror. Would you comment?
I think that's a very appropriate concern. Yesterday I sat in a hearing in front of the House of Representatives. One of the members of the Appropriations Committee, who was grilling the director of the NIH, Harold Varmus, about next year's plans for biomedical research, said basically the same thing. Dr. Varmus, how can you assure me that all of these wonderful scientific advances, particularly in genetics, are going to happen at a pace where we can accommodate for them and we won't end up looking at them in the rearview mirror and finding out that we did some things we wish we hadn't. There are certainly precedents, and I could go through a long list where that has happened. You mentioned the Industrial Revolution. Perhaps more recently people would look at the whole business of splitting the atom and nuclear energy, and were we really prepared for the consequences of that, or did we suddenly realize one day, oh my gosh, look where we're at? I mean, there is a very important part of the genome involved here to try to prevent that kind of catastrophe, that kind of waking up in a crisis result. And I think this is a new experiment. We've never done this before. We've never put ethics and law and social sciences not as an afterthought, but right smack in the middle of this. We're investing in this particular part of the Genome Project, the largest amount that's ever been spent in the history of the planet on ethical research. Now, will it be enough? I don't know. I think we've made great progress, but I think we are now at the interface where legislation is going to be needed to provide the protections, and that's not an area where one can necessarily guarantee the outcome. I think the public has to be well informed about this, and increasingly they are, and the public has to speak up. And recent surveys indicate they're worried about this, and I hope they're saying that to their elected representatives so that we can get those protections in place.
And Dr. Collins, this question is both intellectually and philosophically. You mentioned that the lady that you're talking about had a 12-year-old daughter.
Yes.
Number one, did you examine the daughter, and does she have the gene that you're talking about? And number two, is the time going to come when one would take one's children or one's unborn children to be genetically tested to see how long they live, what they're going to die from, what kind of intelligence they have? Because genes probably can foretell all of that. And the ethical connection with that is just unbelievable to think about.
Well, there's a number of very important points there. I think genes are powerful predictors of certain aspects of human biology, but I think we have to be careful that we don't assume that genes are us and that everything about us can be explained by our DNA sequence. And there's a tendency in the media often sort of fans these flames to imply that every property, whether it's novelty seeking, for which a gene was recently claimed, or infidelity, that was on the cover of Time magazine about a year ago, it's in our genes. And I wonder how many people passed the newsstand that week and said, oh good, I thought it was me. I mean, even when we have all the DNA sequence worked out and all the genes identified and their functions interpreted, we will not understand a lot of human behavior. I don't think we'll understand what love is. I don't think we'll understand intelligence, to be honest. It's such a complicated mix. So there will be limits on the ability to make these predictions, and often they will be sort of statistically, well, the risk is a little higher for this and a little lower for that. This sort of image that a newborn, or even not quite a newborn, could be tested to predict everything about them, I don't think that will quite come to pass. In fact, I don't think it will come to pass in that format at all. Now, you raise another interesting question, which is testing children. Is that appropriate? You have then a collision, because we've been in this situation where in families with a BRCA1 alteration, the parents want to know, does my daughter have this? And yet most of us would argue there's nothing you're going to do for that individual over the course of the next few years, and maybe she'll grow up and wish that she didn't have the information, given that it's not all that clear what you should do with it. And so we in fact will not test children at the present time, and most clinics won't, arguing instead that you should wait until that individual reaches the age of 18, and then they can make their decision about whether they want to know or not. You haven't lost anything. You weren't going to do anything about it right then anyway. But some parents are quite upset about that. They feel that, in general, parents make medical decisions for their children. Why should this be different?
Dr. Collins, a few years ago, Dr. Bernadine Healy spoke at this forum at the time she was running for the U.S. Senate. And at that time, I asked her this question, what possible useful function do the insurance companies have in the healthcare industry? Her answer was, well, that's a leading question. However, having listened to you today, I'd like to ask the same question.
You all don't throw any softballs here, do you? Well, Dr. Healy actually recruited me to the NIH. I'm a fan of hers, and she's obviously a very distinguished resident of this state. So maybe I should follow in her footsteps and try to sidestep the question, but I'll try to do my best. I mean, at the moment, it's the system we've got. Health insurance is the way the U.S. works. That, by the way, distinguishes us from most other well-developed countries. We are one of the few that still maintains that system where people may, in fact, find themselves uninsured, as about 40 million people now do in the United States. And that is, in some ways, deeply troubling. If you argue that health care is a right and not a privilege, then we have a system that doesn't really reflect that. So many, I think, philosophers and ethicists and geneticists viewed the idea of universal health care as something that we ought to be moving towards. It does get around this otherwise very difficult problem of all the pre-existing conditions that we have, because almost all insurance plans involve some degree of actuarial calculations and underwriting and trying to figure out who the company doesn't want to cover. And as soon as you have people that aren't covered through no fault of their own, not because they chose to smoke or chose to exercise in some other high-risk behavior, but just because they inherited some DNA sequence, then you have an unjust system. The ultimate solution to that, I think, probably will have to be some form of universal health care. You cannot, however, in Washington, D.C., this year at least, say anything even close to universal health care or even health care reform without having people look at you as if you just uttered some sort of obscenity, because it's just not on the table. It's not even discussable. In that environment, then, I have to say, the next best thing, and one which I am very enthusiastic about, is doing something about health insurance to take genetic information off the table and say, well, maybe you can use other things, but you can't use this. And that's what the Casabon bill does, and its companion in the House, and that's what Senators Hatfield and Harkin and Feinstein and Mack and Representative Slaughter in the House have all been fighting for, and I applaud those efforts.
Dr. Collins, you mentioned that 1 out of 500 ladies are at risk for cancer, and I understand that to have this test, it would cost a person like $2,000, and that person would not go to the insurance company to be reimbursed under present circumstances, and therefore I wonder what the demand would be for such a test.
I think we don't know what the demand would be. There are companies that expect that even under those circumstances, a lot of people are going to want to know. The company that actually holds, or will hold, presumably when the patent issues, the exclusive rights to diagnostic testing for BRCA1, a company named Myriad, is scaling up to begin offering this test sometime before the end of this year, and they expect to be able to do something like 10,000 tests a year. That's their expectation, at a cost of approximately $1,000 or $2,000. They haven't quite defined that. Will the demand actually be there for that? Is anybody's guess. Many of us, as I mentioned earlier, are concerned about that kind of testing being marketed to primary care physicians who may not be in a very good position to know how to use this testing and how to explain the results. Because, as I said, most physicians don't have much training in this field. And I don't think it will take too many real disasters in terms of somebody being tested, maybe even without knowing the test had been ordered, and then being given very frightening information without the chance to figure out what it really means for them, before the public sort of says, wait, stop, we don't want anything to do with this. I mean, imagine a couple of covers of Newsweek on this topic, and the whole idea of genetic testing and preventive medicine will sort of get set back years, the way that sickle cell testing was in the 1970s by sort of poor planning. So we don't need to have that outcome. That's why I'm particularly excited about this network that the National Cancer Institute is setting up. And I suspect, again, I don't know what the demand will be, but I suspect that if it's done right, the majority of women who are tested over the course of the next couple of years will do it through this network in a way that preserves really good educational information, preserves informed consent, has sort of a uniform protocol so that everybody's hearing the same thing and having the same choices, and may even provide a pool of funds for individuals who don't have the resources to actually pay for the test. And that's another major concern. Will only those who have independent resources of considerable nature be able to afford to go through this? And it's just going to be too bad for the others. That seems very inequitable.
Dr. Collins, you've brought us very important information, and I'm very pleased that you're here with us. If you had a child who absolutely represents the kind of syndrome that you've talked about with this potential for cancer, on what basis have you been able to do this test, and are you the only place where this can take place at this present moment?
Yeah, again, I've focused particularly today on BRCA1 because I think it's a paradigm. It raises many of the issues, but there are certainly other conditions for which testing is at least theoretically possible because the genes have been found. Many of those are rarer conditions. Colon cancer is the other one that's relatively common, for which the testing is at least theoretically possible. But all of these things, all of these gene discoveries are less than 2 years old. It is not practical for research laboratories to do this kind of testing on any kind of large scale. So if it's going to happen, it will need to be done in a commercial laboratory where quality control is clearly attended to. So at the present time, there are very few protocols available for individuals who want to have this testing. But again, through this network, that is going to expand in the course of, say, the next 6 months. And the expectation is that that will then make testing available in any community of a size that has a large medical center, because I suspect physicians in that community will then decide they want to participate. So the access is going to go up. Whether people sign up for it is anybody's bet. There are some other issues that maybe you're also alluding to in terms of testing. I mean, how do we decide that a test is ready to leave research and go into clinical practice? Whose decision is that? Is that just because a company has decided they can make some money on it, so they start marketing it to the public? I mean, you wouldn't allow that if you were talking about a drug that had toxic side effects. You'd have a process to decide when it's ready to be given outside of a research clinical trial. For testing, we don't have that, and some of us are worried about that. Testing can be beneficial. It can also have risks. It can be toxic to get this information if it's not explained to you in an appropriate way, or if you're given the information when you really didn't want it. And therefore, I think we have to look carefully at that process. We have a task force on genetic testing, which has been meeting for about a year with the strong support of Secretary Shalala. And they have produced, about a month ago, about a 70-page set of draft principles of which should govern this process of testing. Everything from laboratory quality control to how decisions are made about when the test is released as part of clinical medicine. Those are being carefully studied by many groups, and it will be very interesting to see how well those sit. They will be controversial. That task force expects to produce implementation recommendations in another 6 to 8 months, and hopefully we will then have a better blueprint of where to go.
Thank you, Dr. Francis Collins, Director of the Human Genome Project. Thank you, one and all. To order an audio or videotape of City Club programs, call 216-621-0082. The City Club Forum is adjourned.
Major funding for production of the City Club Forum is provided by Nordson Corporation. Additional support provided by the Nord Family Foundation.